So we've finally gotten an update on the Silent Hill 2 remake, and people are concerned. Fans of Silent Hill 2 regularly attest to how intense and emotional experience they had when playing the game. It's a dense, complex, layered text with confronting content. It thematizes issues such as mental illness, suffering, grief, loss, self-loathing, family violence, gendered violence, objectification, and dehumanization. These themes reflect both complex sociocultural phenomena and intense personal experiences. Bloober Team really has it ahead of them, and considering their past games have been widely criticized for neglecting to depict serious issues such as these with the appropriate nuance, well, everybody's a bit concerned. Welcome to a loading screen. I'm your host, Kiva, and I really want to get into some discussion about the Silent Hill 2 remake. I'll admit, because we hadn't heard anything about Silent Hill 2 remake since 2022, I was getting concerned that it might have gone the way of Bloodlines 2. I'm relieved to get an update on the project. Despite how nervous I am about just how wrong this remake could go, there's this little optimistic voice in me that wonders, what if it goes well? Just what if? Yet, when I saw the new gameplay trailer, I was both concerned and intrigued. I'd love to reflect on what we saw in the trailer, do some analysis of the creative decisions we saw, and discuss the implications for Silent Hill 2 as a text that represents violence in reference to the changes we've seen in the remake so far. And no doubt I'm going to get academic and granular about it because there's just so much complexity to Silent Hill 2, but I'll really try to keep this video to a reasonable length. This video is full of spoilers.
How can you sit there and eat pizza?
And discusses what's in the new trailer from the perspective of someone who is familiar with the original game. I'll blend some analysis of the original and the remake and discuss some elements of the original text that are so important for Bloober Team to get right and why I think this is the case. Alright, let's dig in. I want to start out positive, so first of all, I think the environments we saw in this trailer look absolutely fantastic. I think they've got the grimy, dilapidated buildings spot on. I think the lighting also looks incredible. We get to see the Woodside and Blue Creek apartment complexes and the hospital in the trailer. These environments were instantly recognizable, which is a really good sign. The apartment blocks were incredibly dark in the original, which frankly was horrifying. The pitch darkness instills a sense of vulnerability. Understandably, the remake has cranked up the light a bit so we can actually see some of the details of the environment, and I think it works. The interior is still really dark, but it seems a hint of sunlight creeps in from the outside, particularly in the hall, which makes the environment more dramatic and shows us how dilapidated this apartment building is. Unless that's the hospital? Either way, the apartments themselves look great, with that crazy deep green floral wallpaper. It looks like despite wanting to show players more detail, the remake has not sacrificed the oppressive darkness of Silent Hill 2, and that is a tricky balance to strike. The moment where James has to leap between the apartment blocks looks amazing. There's more depth in the strange, uncanny, impossible alleyway between the two walls of the apartments. Frankly, I think this is shown better than it was in the original. We get a better sense of space and what could happen if James falls between the two buildings. Excellent job. And that's kind of the end of me gushing about what we've seen, so let's really dig in. I am not a fan of the camera placement for gameplay. I was concerned about this in the first trailer we saw, and this concern has not faded. I know the almost fixed camera angles from the original are vastly outdated, but it sort of feels like the deliberateness of camera placement has been replaced with the notion of conforming to the survival horror or action game convention of the over-the-shoulder camera. The camera placement was a tool that the original game used to intentionally direct the player's attention and frame James in specific ways. The camera could make the environment engulf James. It could make players panic over what's around the corner. If we get the over-the-shoulder camera when we walk into the morgue in the basement of the Silent Hill Historical Society / Imaginary Toluca prison, something will definitely be lost in adaptation. The trailer showed us in-game activities such as walking and fighting. I know I've heard some people disliking the walking animation, and I can sort of see their point, but I appreciated that James doesn't have like a really stylized walk. It's rather casual, which fits because he's just an odd guy in a weird place, right? It did look a little wonky in the shot where James kind of nudges open a door. It looked a little awkward, and like the trigger for the animation didn't really kind of line up properly. It's sort of out of sync. Maybe that's just me. It also reminded me of the dynamic way characters open doors in the Resident Evil 2 remake. In fact, many people have compared what's in this new trailer to the Resident Evil 2 remake in aesthetics and general vibes. And let's reflect, the Resident Evil 2 remake was fantastic. We lost our minds when that game came out. It kickstarted a whole new phase for Resident Evil, so that comparison, in my opinion, is not a criticism, until you stop to consider that the RE2 remake came out in 2018, which despite me still thinking that was like last year, it was actually an entire epoch ago. I myself was reminded of RE2 Remake on my first viewing of the trailer, and in my head I thought, oh cool, and then I thought, oh I thank you for your noble sacrifice. We glimpse some recognisable puzzle items in the trailer, and it looks like we're getting at least a few new puzzles to keep us on our toes. I think the new puzzles are a great addition. I just really hope that they don't contradict or conflict with the narrative elements of the game. We'll have to see how that goes. The trailer's focus on combat is frankly surprising and maybe kind of disappointing. The original game had combat, and so it's logical that combat should be in the remake, and it should be improved with modern sensibilities, and they should probably show us this thing in a trailer at some point. However, combat is not a selling point for Silent Hill as a franchise and intellectual property. The game should still have well-animated and well-functioning combat, but it's not about a combat-focused experience. This isn't a full Resident Evil, and there is no bingo in Silent Hill. They do, however, have bowling.
I hate bowling.
And from what I've seen in YouTube comments so far, people are concerned about the combat animations being a bit wonky anyway. A lack of detail in the lying figure enemies and the QuickTime button prompt that flashes on the screen when James is being grabbed by an enemy. Everybody's in a fuss, it's a bit tense. But this is a great opportunity for the team to tweak things like this before the release. Silent Hill 2 of the future needs to be a well-rounded gaming experience, but I maintain that the focus of the work should be the themes of the narrative. The very first shot of the new gameplay trailer is that of James in an apartment looking at a man slumped in a chair in front of a static TV. This is a pretty recognisable moment from the original. In the original, the camera never approached an angle that would show the face of the man slumped over in front of the television. The camera showed the figure from a high angle, and we really only saw the top of the figure's head. Yet in the remake, with the increased maneuverability and control of a modern game camera, the team would have had to account somehow for the player being able to catch a glimpse of the man's face. The solution, I think, was to hide him under a rag. It's fine, and the blood-soaked nature of the rag is definitely disturbing, but I can't help but feel that there was more tension in the scenario in which the man's face was bare and the camera just never moved to show it. This would encourage players to attempt to move around the room to try and peer around the chair to get a closer look at the figure. The dark light, distant camera angle, and noise filter obfuscate the image of a man slumped in front of a television buzzing with static. The player can spy the figure wearing the same shade of green as James on his torso. And are those jeans like James is wearing? The player can't just confirm the suspicion that this deceased figure looks a bit much like him. The original blocking and visual stylings of this scene operate the power of suggestion on the player's mind and induce a paranoia. What would it mean if this person did look like James? The apartment block levels work hard to instill paranoia into the player's mind in many different ways. These levels do a lot of foundational groundwork for the text's thematization, from the man getting sick and protesting he didn't kill the guy in the fridge, to the eerie connection between the stationary mannequin wearing Mary's clothes and the monstrous mannequin that springs to life from behind it, to the game forcing James into close proximity with mannequins that will kick him and then show a bigger, badder monster hurting these mannequins. The player can't help but wonder, is the game drawing a parallel between James and the Red Pyramid thing? What does it really mean to hit these femme-coated monsters with a stick? Should the player be doing this? Should we even be here? And what is James really capable of? Silent Hill 2 ties the functional mechanical element of video game combat to its narrative and thematic purpose by making the implication that doing this violence represents something deeper, something darker. In my opinion, Silent Hill 2 achieves a state of ludonarrative harmony by deliberately tainting the video game convention of combat with guilt, by linking the monsters to Mary and linking James to Pyramid Head. As we discover later, James ended Mary's life, and as sexual frustration was at play in his motivation, it makes sense why Silent Hill would reflect gendered violence back to him. And we are not meant to be okay with this. The revelation that James ended Mary's life makes all that early game paranoia come crashing down on the player, that the violence done to the monsters did represent a terrible thing that happened in James's life, a terrible thing that James chose to do. The game weaponizes all its hints and suggestions against the player. Then we see a little girl's grief. We see the emotional cost of James's actions as Laura punches him repeatedly, desperately, and cries that she hates him. As fellow YouTuber Not Wallace explored how the game brings James and the player's subjective position into alignment, the player is also, by association, the focus of Laura's grief. As a text, I think Silent Hill 2 has the potential to explore some significant themes. You may have noticed that there's like 15 million video essays on the original Silent Hill 2, which speaks to its ability to, well, speak to people. The game engages with really serious ideas and themes. And as a result, the game is confronting and at times contentious. Does it explore all of its ideas perfectly? Well, I'd say there's room for critical reflection and careful examination to drive towards an answer to that question, but the original is very certainly effective. With so many big ideas and big emotions Silent Hill 2 has in it, the concern is that the remake might not do them justice. I think Silent Hill fans are awaiting the remake with great trepidation. There's a lot of pressure on Bloober Team to get this right, but what if they do? What if we can take an already nuanced and complex text and elevate it? In my opinion, that would be the point of a remake. We should improve, we could fix, we could further explore. My concern for the Silent Hill 2 remake is that since there is more technological capacity to show more and do more, that things like violence against these creatures will become more of a spectacle than it was in the original. If the violence against these monsters is more of a spectacle, this could seriously negatively impact on the thematization of the text. As we can see, combat is going to be different in the remake. The camera being positioned over James's shoulder more tightly puts us in closer proximity to the combat. This trailer heavily focused on the game's combat and repeatedly showed James swinging a plank of wood with nails in it at the enemies. The combat reminded me slightly of Homecoming, which prioritized lengthy combat scenarios and combos. It wasn't good. But Silent Hill 2 is not a fighting game, and the reason it is not a fighting game is because the original had a clear narrative goal, which all of the design elements were driven toward. I think there's a possibility that this modernized combat style might work against that narrative goal. The original game set the camera much further back for most of the combat, even in tight areas, where the game would place the camera higher above James than you would see in the remake trailer. Despite the game's efforts to align the player with James, we generally maintained a crucial distance from combat, which conceptually encouraged a critical distance from the game's combat. I'd like to mention, once again, the video made by one Not Wallace, who explores how the game aligns players with James's subject position. Not Wallace does really excellent work drawing on Judith Butler's work in this analysis and interpretation. It's such an interesting video. I really do encourage more people to go watch it for a really interesting analysis of how the game aligns the player's agency and James's and uses that to implicate us all in the societal problems that Silent Hill 2 explores. I think the distance between James and the camera is an important element in Silent Hill 2, because while the game is aligning James and the player, the visual distance between the camera and James subtly suggests that we should be trying to look at the bigger picture here. It reminds us to maintain a critical distance with a character who is later revealed to be responsible for a terrible thing. That critical distance then becomes instrumental in the process of reading the text as a critical analysis and reflection of the internal phenomena that resulted in this terrible thing. And suddenly, the symbolism of the monsters, Pyramid Head's actions, Maria's suffering all makes sense. And I worry if we stick with the over-the-shoulder camera in the remake, we might lose some of that. It's really too early to say, but it's just, it could work out when the game is released, and that would be good if it works out and nothing bad is implied about the themes of the work. We'll have to see, but I am concerned. Granted, there are functional limits to the camera work of the original game, where at times it was frustrating that players can't see where the monsters are, or you get caught fighting off a monster in an awkward spot, especially in the hospital. It makes logical sense for the remake to update the camera work from the original to match contemporary video game conventions to a certain reasonable extent, and we'll see if Bloober Team can strike that balance. The trailer showed us that the mannequins look much more fleshy than they did in the original, and I think this is due to the capacity for higher graphical fidelity. Hi-fi, man. But what happens in the text, on the level of theme, when the monsters look demonstrably more human? What happens when the visual language of the work and the placement of the camera centralizes doing violence against these creatures? The question I have for Silent Hill 2 is, will these changes reframe the combat, the violence against symbols encoded as femme, differently? Dangerously? There's a certain level of responsibility required of creatives who make works that engage with concepts such as misogyny, gendered violence, mental illness, and harmful exertions of power over others, and I'm already skeptical of Bloober Team's capacity to undertake that kind of responsibility. Blair Witch. The normalization of violence and gendered violence has serious consequences. We're still needing to have really serious conversations about the way violence is represented in media, from fiction to news reports. In Karen Boyle's book, Media and Violence, Gendering the Debate, Boyle recognises the double status of media as a site at which real-life violence is reflected on, emulated, represented, and a site that produces social and cultural ideas and scripts to explain violence. Or, to put it another way, creators draw on real life to create works, and the ways that works represent violence, especially by relying on narrative conventions and patterns of tropes and cliches, these works act as some of the frames of reference which people use to make sense of things that happen in the real world. Boyle highlights how media that represent violence act as resources from which data, ideas, stories, perspectives, contexts about violence is drawn. Some media that reproduce harmful notions about violence, such as victim blaming, making a spectacle of suffering, the dehumanization and objectification of people as based on gender, can have real consequences in what becomes normalized in the zeitgeist. If violence and objectification are normalized, then it is harder to detect the social and cultural mechanisms at work within society that enable them to harm people. But what does this have to do with Silent Hill 2? In a discussion of the way victims of real-life serial killers are represented in media, Boyle states, "There is a fine line between registering the horror and turning the victim's violated body into a voyeuristic object to be looked at without identification, empathy, or a desire for justice." While Silent Hill 2 isn't necessarily about serial killers, this quote inspires me to question the representations of victims of violence in the game, particularly in relation to Mary, Maria, and the monsters James fights in the game. Silent Hill 2's representations of the monsters had always sat on what Boyle calls that fine line. How should we evaluate how the text has us watch violence being done to Maria so often? Is it a criticism of that violence, or is Maria's suffering a spectacle? Is her suffering merely a tool, a means for James's internal transformation and realization? Is she being used? Is Mary's radical absence a powerful statement about the horror of James ending her life, or is the focus on James's interior world erasing Mary's pain? Are the monsters of Silent Hill 2 just dehumanizing the femme, or is dehumanization and sexual objectification the subject of the thematic exploration of the text that reveals dehumanization and objectification as horrific? And what does that mean when players are meant to hit these monsters? What does that mean for the updated, more realistic, conventional combat system of the remake? I'd like to note here that the context for which I drew out that last quote of Karen Boyle's was a discussion about how media, news, documentaries, and fiction discusses victims, particularly when one person has taken the lives of many victims. Boyle explores the problems with lumping all the victims together in one group, with the only thing recurrently acknowledged about their identities is their status as victims of violence. This is embedded within a larger socio-cultural issue of dehumanization of victims and victim survivors. And sometimes I wonder, are the monsters of Silent Hill 2 falling into that pattern? Karen Boyle continues, "If we lose sight of the victims in these cases, we can all too easily become uncritical consumers of crime and lose the sense of purpose, indeed of urgency, that drives feminist study, research, and activism in this field." So what precisely does Silent Hill 2 keep in sight? As new players begin the game, they believe Mary dies of that damned disease 3 years ago. But we discover that James actually ended her life. Mary is linked to the monsters in Silent Hill 2 via 2 key scenes in the early game. When James picks up the radio, which is a series staple and is used to alert players to when monsters are nearby, James is attacked by the game's first lying figure monster. Then hears Mary's voice cut through the static of the radio he acquired. She asks, "Why did you kill me?" Later, in the Woodside apartments, James finds a flashlight he needs to progress pinned to the lapel of a stationary mannequin dressed in the same clothes Mary is wearing in a photo of her James carries with him. Once he picks it up, the game's mannequin enemy type springs to life to attack him. James has the option of beating it with a stick or running away. This scene links the idea of Mary to the mannequin monster. Why? Well, I could do a whole deep dive on that scene alone. I'm talking like hour plus. But in a few words, the game here represents objectification. I think we glimpsed the all-important flashlight scene in the new gameplay trailer. There's a few frames of pure darkness and then James turns on his flashlight, and from the burst of light lunges a mannequin. We can also barely make out the silhouette of a stationary mannequin on screen to the right of James. The mannequin looks to be dressed in a coat of some sort. Now, the mannequin is not wearing Mary's outfit from the original, but we don't know as yet if James will have a photo of her that might still match the outfit on this mannequin, but I am concerned that they have changed this scene from the original. The clothes of the mannequin might also have been changed for the trailer, not to spoil too much of the game before it's released, because it kind of looks like something's been overlaid on top of the footage. It just looks a little funky. But still, this scene is one that is integral to encouraging the player to question what fighting the monsters really means in Silent Hill 2, and even the way the monsters are designed invite this kind of questioning. The juxtaposition between these two mannequins is one of the ways the game uses to symbolize the truth of what happened between Mary and James. The once healthy version of Mary, who was able and available, is represented by the stationary mannequin, though it's interesting that it cannot move. The active mannequin represents what happened to her as her illness impacted her. The illness changed her body and revealed the sexual objectification that was underlying her relationship with James. Once Mary wasn't available to him for physical intimacy, the relationship took a darker, murkier tone. What is often referred to as James's sexual frustration also represents the cultural assumptions around relationships and marriage, that Mary, as a wife, should be available to James. And the more that this was impossible, the closer James drew to violence. Now, of course, it's reasonable for a spouse to be devastated when their significant other falls ill, and I'm not disparaging James for having a tough time with this ordeal. What the game does bring into sharp focus is the underlying misogynistic assumption of the entitlement to his wife's body. The monsters reflect it, Pyramid Head reflects it, and James's scenes with Maria reflect it. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" Maria asks in the jail cell, for her to be available for intimacy. But when he finds a way to where she is, she's dead. Her face disfigured by the same illness that harmed Mary. Again, being upset, devastated, lonely while the spouse goes through a devastating illness is normal. But when, how, and why did the want of access to her body being denied become more urgent than her life? James's turn to violence is what the game criticizes, and it's the insidious underlying social norms that underlie society that create the conditions in which this happens. The monsters in Silent Hill 2 represent that underlying misogyny. Recognizably feminine bodies are dehumanized, their sex characteristics exaggerated, they're adorned with feminized and revealing clothing, and they are subject to the violence of both Pyramid Head and James himself, reflecting the very crime that brought James to Silent Hill, ending his wife's life. But at what point does a text go from making misogyny, objectification, dehumanization, and gendered violence the subject of a text, through including symbolically femme monsters, to merely just emulating gendered violence on screen? I worry the answer to that question is when the combat itself becomes the focus of the work, when we get a trailer that spends half its runtime with a man whacking feminized bodies with sticks, with the camera focused on the power of his swing, and the way the being impacted by it recoils. Though, people have said that the enemies don't recoil accurately, and maybe that's a good thing. I'm worried that making the Silent Hill 2 remake too combat-focused will undermine the suggestion the original made to its players to regard the violence in the game with suspicion, discomfort, and a lingering sense of guilt. The monsters in the remake clearly have a higher graphical fidelity. It looks like the lying figure monsters are dressed in stockings, as was the original design seen in Masahiro Ito's concept art. The stockings act as a symbol that creates some explicit femme coding for the monsters. These lying figures explicitly reference female genitalia much more than in the original. It also looks like the monsters are not all identical. There are some design variations. Some nurses are covered in a dark substance, perhaps blood, perhaps some kind of tar. As for the mannequins, some of them have these white bandages around them, connoting illness or injury, and some are more bloodied than others. These designs connote femness and violence together. The mannequins are femme bodies segmented, intervened, rearranged. This is particularly pronounced when placed in contrast to the stationary mannequin in the Woodside apartment complex from which James picks up the flashlight. The scene where James picks up the flashlight and the association between Mary and the monsters that it suggests implies that James's violence against them should not only be read in the context of surviving the video game, but instead as a facet of the thematic exploration of Mary's suffering, her dehumanization, sexual objectification, and the body horror associated with becoming ill and watching her body deteriorate, all the while knowing that James is more and more dissatisfied with her. There is much discussion around James experiencing frustration because Mary became ill and they couldn't be intimate, but what is discussed less often is how the game shows us glimpses of what that experience was like for Mary. Imagine being turned into one of those mannequins. The scene in which James picks up the flashlight is one of those moments. Imagine feeling the pressure to be a good wife in florals and pinks, but have your bodily autonomy ripped away from you by an illness you couldn't predict nor control whilst your flesh rots. The mannequin monsters simultaneously represent how the illness changed her body and the normalized objectification projected onto her by society. The flashlight scene does a lot of work in thematizing this idea in Silent Hill 2. A new puzzle is hinted at alongside the footage of the flashlight scene though. There is some kind of puzzle with a wardrobe locked by a pair of brass hands. The wardrobe doors open to reveal a white gown hanging inside. I wondered if this was meant to be a wedding dress. The dress looks formal, if a little bit outdated. If it is a wedding dress, this new addition to the game may, in some way, speak to the subject of James and Mary's marriage in a similar way to the original flashlight picking up scene. I say this because I assume this is happening in the Woodside apartments, but there is a possibility that this might occur in Brookhaven Hospital, because in the original, that section of the game referenced the concept of marriage through a puzzle where James had to give rings to a statue in a wall, and later Maria and James had to work together to open a fridge. Which many have interpreted as a commentary on James's feelings about marriage. So this remains to be seen. I'd like to note that the 15th time I watched through this trailer for writing this video, I realised that when the left wrist turns and the cupboard opens, which I think is the animation designed to indicate a success state for solving the puzzle, once the wrist faces down, it looks like both wrists are bound in restraints of some kind, which certainly has implications for being presented by a prolific icon representing marriage. I'm really interested to see what the context is around this puzzle, and especially if there's flavor text or a riddle or anything, and what James has to say about the dress, and overall what the tone of this juxtaposition will be. Will it be a thoughtful reflection on the role of marriage as an institution that has impacted James and Mary's story? Will it just be a cheap mishmash of potent signifiers? Will it villainize Mary? We'll have to wait and find out. I really hope it doesn't give Mary the villain edit. The original was more nuanced than that, and this is why I'm so concerned about this remake. I feel like it could turn on a dime. And that's what brings me back to my point for this section. Does Silent Hill 2 keep sight of the victims of the abuse and violence as it represents, as Karen Boyle might say? Hopefully for the lying figures, we still hear Mary's voice over the radio near when they're introduced to link Mary's distress with the horror of the lying figures. The mannequin monsters require the context of the flashlight mannequin scene for their symbolism to make sense, and I've got my fingers crossed that they've not changed that for the remake. But what about the nurses? Grotesque caricatures of women in service roles marked by violence. Does this objectify further? What about the popularity of the Silent Hill nurse image across the franchise? Is this design a responsible way of engaging with the text themes? What about Maria, who appears in Silent Hill, is the spitting image of Mary and at times speaks with her voice and memories and becomes subject to violence at the hands of Pyramid Head 3 times in the game? The violence Pyramid Head enacts on Maria is allegorical for the violence James enacted upon Mary, which slowly leads James to realise he was in a deep state of denial over ending his wife's life. We haven't seen anything of Angela Orozco, who in the original game was a victim survivor of a horrific family abuse. Silent Hill 2 kept Angela as a person sharply in focus, showing us very little of her trauma directly, but giving her ample narrative time to demonstrate how this abuse has inflected her character. I get the sense that the advertising for this game might be trying to hold some things back for the benefit of new players. They're trying not to spoil it, which makes sense. There's probably a lot of people who might play Silent Hill 2 for the first time with this remake. But will this remake keep its sight on Angela's humanity? On Mary and Maria's humanity? I certainly hope so. If not, this whole thing sort of falls apart very fast. I really hope we get a confirmed release date for the remake soon. I do wonder if the absence of a confirmed release date for the Silent Hill 2 remake means the developers are just as anxious as we are about the project, but that is pure speculation. I think there are so many ways to explore enhancing the original text of Silent Hill 2, and I'm really hopeful that we're going to get that in the remake. I'd prefer some really excellent narrative, thematic, textual work to optimal graphics and gameplay, honestly. Like, I think it looks alright, and I'll be ecstatic if Bloober can really make a meaningful, nuanced take on Silent Hill 2 and set everyone's minds at ease, especially those of us who have played the Blair Witch game, because it was not nuanced. But prove us wrong, Bloober. Be the underdog who could. I'd love to hear what you think about the new trailer. I'd love to know if people are more excited or more worried about the remake. We all know we've been burned before with the HD collection, so I won't be surprised if there's a lot of trepidation about it. Or if you made it this far, post an exclamation mark in the comments and we can commiserate how much we like to overthink Silent Hill. I'm looking forward to doing more Silent Hill analyses down the line, so if you're up for it, subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you so much for watching. This has been A Loading Screen. I'm your host, Kiva, and until next time.